Welcome to Daily Book Dive. Today, the book we will dive in is Factfulness. This book uses vast amounts of data and clear charts to prove that the world is getting better, not worse. Most people imagine the world to be very bad because they are misled by their cognitive instincts. To solve this problem, we must learn to make decisions based on data and overcome the limitations of our cognitive instincts. Before we start, please click on the subscribe button below to stay updated. Let me start by asking a question. You think the world is getting better or worse? If you think of the war still raging around the world, the many refugees, and the huge gap between rich and poor, most people would probably answer worse. But can you answer some basic questions about the state of the world? Let's do a few self-assessment questions to see how much you know about the world. Where do most of the world's population live? In low-income countries, middle-income countries, or high-income countries? What is the average life expectancy of the world population? 50 years, 60 years, or 70 years? How many people in the world have access to electricity? 20%, 50%, or 80%? Now let's reveal the correct answers and see if you got them right. Most of the population lives in middle-income countries. The average life expectancy is 70 years. 80% of the world's population has access to electricity. Did you get them all right? If you did, congratulations, you're at least in the top 20% of people. If you got them wrong, you're like most people who don't have enough knowledge about the world. The author of this book has been giving lectures around the world for many years. During each lecture, he presents 13 questions for the audience to answer, including the 3 we just did. The audience includes high-level leaders from the Davos Forum, top students from Cornell University, and ordinary middle school teachers from Nordic countries. Guess what the highest accuracy rate for a single question is? 26%. What does this probability mean? If you let a gorilla in the zoo randomly choose, the accuracy rate would be 33%, higher than all the audiences. Why is this? The author says it is because inherent cognitive instincts hinder our correct understanding of the world. He lists 10 instincts in the book and provides solutions for each. Bill Gates highly recommended this book in his 2018 summer reading list, saying it offers very practical advice to help us overcome the limitations of our cognitive instincts. The author, Hans Rosling, was a professor specializing in statistics and medicine. He spent many years lecturing globally to promote public health development. His 2006 TED Talk received millions of views, making him famous. Bill Gates once said that the Gates Foundation donated billions of dollars to healthcare projects in developing countries, mainly because of Rosling's speech. After introducing the author, I'll share the details of the book. The main theme of the book is its title, Factfulness. Based on this theme, I've distilled 3 key points. Data proves that the world is getting better, not worse. By extending and broadening our perspective, we can see the enormous progress humanity has made through data. Most people think the world is getting worse. Why do such fundamental misconceptions occur? What cognitive instincts mislead us? And how should we deal with these instincts? Part 1. Let's start with the first key point. Data proves that the world is getting better. The author emphasizes facts, and facts are essentially data. However, data without proper presentation is just a pile of sand. The author's foundation even developed software specifically for data visualization, which has been acquired by Google. The book includes a large amount of data and visual charts, rigorous and detailed. It is worth mentioning that the data used by the author all come from publicly available data on the United Nations and World Bank websites. Let's see how the data provided by the author prove that the world is getting better. Did you know there is an African country called Lesotho, completely surrounded by South Africa? It was a British colony and developed poorly after independence, making it one of the world's least developed countries. About half of its population struggles below the extreme poverty line, living on less than $2 a day. This country's development level is equivalent to Sweden in 1891. In other words, more than a century ago, the Nordic countries, which we now see as well developed, were at this level, not to mention other countries and regions. The author's grandmother was born in Sweden's Lesotho era, which from today's perspective, is extreme poverty. The entire family's clothes were washed by hand by the grandmother, there was no tap water at home, only self-drawn water, and none of the grandparents' generation had more than 4 years of schooling, all being semi-literate. By the author's generation, he was born in 1948, grew up in the countryside, and nearly drowned in mud when his grandmother put him in a mud ditch for a bath, leaving a deep psychological shadow. Later, he went to university, got a PhD, founded a foundation, and gave lectures worldwide, things he couldn't even dream of as a child. The author shares his experience because he wants to say that to see if the world is getting better, we need to see if good things are increasing and bad things are decreasing. Over the past 2 centuries, bad things have decreased significantly. For example, legal slavery has disappeared, the child mortality rate has dropped from 44% to less than 4%, and the proportion of people in extreme poverty has decreased from 80% to 9%. Some may say that such a long period of history has nothing to do with me. In my decades of life, maybe the world is getting worse? Then let's look at the progress over these decades. The author still uses data to illustrate. For instance, the proportion of people infected with HIV reached its peak in 1996 and has now halved. The emission of substances that destroy the ozone layer was 1.66 million tons in 1970, but by 2016 it had decreased to 20,000 tons. Let's not forget that many good things are increasing. In the early 20th century, even in the most free and democratic countries, women had no political rights. But in recent decades, the proportion of girls receiving education has steadily increased from 65% to 90%, and the overall literacy rate has soared from less than 20% to 86% in 2016. The proportion of people receiving vaccinations has skyrocketed from 22% to 88%. Today, half the world's population enjoys the convenience of the internet, which did not exist in 1980. Seeing this data, do you feel the world is getting better? The author himself says that although the world is getting better, sounds like a motivational speech, it is an undeniable fact before us. This data is publicly available on the United Nations official website, and you can check it if you are interested. By the way, here's an exclusive piece of data from the author. In 1962, there were only 200 guitars per million people. By 2014, there was at least 1 guitar per 100 people. How does this data prove the world is getting better? Think about it. In 1962, guitars were considered luxury items, and owning a guitar meant you were either rich or a cultural elite. But today, guitars are very common instruments, easily purchased without leaving home, allowing more people to enjoy leisure life and the joy of music. This is the first key point to share. The author lists a lot of data showing that over the past 2 centuries, good things have been increasing, and bad things have been decreasing. Data tells us the world is getting better. Part 2. Next, let's look at the second key point. Why do most people have the wrong perception of the world? The world's poverty rate has halved in recent decades, one of humanity's greatest achievements. However, according to the author's survey, only 7% of people know the correct answer. You might also find this accuracy rate surprisingly low. Moreover, people's wrong answers are very consistent. For example, in the question we mentioned at the beginning, what is the average life expectancy of the world population? 20 years, 50 years, or 70 years? The correct answer is 70 years, but most people chose 50 years. The author believes this shows that people are not ignorant but blinded by wrong knowledge. Where does this wrong knowledge come from? The author summarizes several sources. First, it comes from books and teachers. The author conducted a questionnaire survey among some middle school teachers in Norway, and was shocked to find that these teachers, responsible for educating students, also did not know the world's real situation. Their knowledge was also wrong. The main reason for the error is that the knowledge is outdated. These wrong answers were correct in the 1960s and 1970s, but the world has changed so fast that if not updated in time, they become wrong knowledge. In fact, many people stop updating their knowledge once they leave school, leading to a skewed perception of the world. Second is the role of the media. Many people take media reports as the truth about the world, but in the survey, journalists, editors, and documentary directors had no better understanding of the world than ordinary people. They were equally misled by wrong knowledge, resulting in distorted reports. The author also points out that the media always report the negative, not the positive. There's an old saying, "Good news doesn't travel far, bad news does." This is both a media rule and part of human nature. The media cannot provide truly objective reports, and we should not take what the media say as truth. For example, the crime rate in the US has been decreasing since 1990. But in social surveys, most people believe it has increased because media headlines are about crimes, not the decreasing crime rate. In recent years, with the development of the internet and other communication technologies, it has become easier for us to hear bad news from around the world. For example, after a report of an international student being raped by refugees, almost all parents of international students would believe that Europe is full of refugees, and their children are in constant danger, which is not the case. But these two reasons are not the whole story. The author also tested the participants of the Davos World Economic Forum, who have access to the latest and richest information, and are unlikely to be misled by news. On some issues, such as the number of people in extreme poverty, they answered correctly 61% of the time. But on other issues, such as population growth trends and basic health conditions, they still gave wrong answers. So we need to dig deeper. In his continued exploration, the author discovered the most important reason. The inherent cognitive mechanisms evolved in the human brain during long-term natural struggle. Humans can be deceived by their own brains. Just as we can't control our instinct to eat junk food, we also can't control our tendency to imagine the world as dangerous. This is an inherent cognitive instinct that helped our ancestors survive in harsh environments, but is not suited to today's rapidly changing world. For example, bad news spreads fast is a kind of pessimism instinct, meaning humans are naturally more inclined to notice bad things. In ancient times, being constantly alert to potential threats was a survival instinct, which still affects our thinking today. This pessimism instinct not only fosters our tendency to worry, but also exaggerates current difficulties. For instance, older people often glorify and reminisce about their youth, believing that the past was better and each generation is worse than the last. A few years ago, society worried that the post-80s generation was selfish and degenerate, enjoying themselves without contributing, a concern proven baseless but continuing to befall every generation of young people. As mentioned earlier, data has shown that the world is getting better. Of course, there are many things we need to worry about, such as environmental degradation, global terrorism, and financial crises. We cannot let our guard down, but this does not negate our achievements. While continuing to fight against bad things, we can also celebrate human achievements. These two are not mutually exclusive. The author hopes people will not be pessimistic without reason, exaggerating bad consequences. To deal with this instinct, we need to have a clear understanding of the severe situations while also seeing the improving trends. Part 3. Humans have many other instincts as well. When facing urgent dangers, these instincts are simple, crude, and effective. But when people start thinking about complex realities, these instincts interfere with rationality. Moreover, human nature includes a love for drama and conflict, sometimes even using feelings instead of reason. For example, when people say, "The world is getting worse," they often mean, "I feel bad." But rationality is what we need most. If leaders and elites cannot view the world correctly, how can we ordinary people deal with instincts and make the right decisions? Let's share the third key point, also the essence of the book. Reflecting on and controlling our cognitive instincts. The author summarizes 10 cognitive instincts that trouble us, affecting either our cognitive framework or letting emotions hijack our rationality. I've selected a few major instincts for detailed analysis. First, the binary thinking instinct is most important, dividing everything into black and white. Think about it, do you have concepts of the West versus non-West, or North-South divide in your mind? These are manifestations of binary thinking. This instinct comes from ancient times when humans were very weak. To adapt to the environment, they had to quickly classify food as edible or inedible, animals as friendly or dangerous, almost without thinking, relying on intuition. Today we easily accept binary concepts, dividing the world into us and them, the biggest misunderstanding of the world. But is the world really divided by a chasm? Let's use facts to speak. Look at the data on fertility and child survival rates, which represent a country's development level. We divide all countries into developed and developing countries. Usually, we think developed countries have low fertility rates with 2 or 3 children per family and high child survival rates over 95%, while developing countries have high fertility rates with at least 4 or 5 children per family, and low survival rates with only half surviving. The US and Western European countries are, of course, at the developed end, while India, China, and other developing countries are at the other end. This seems correct. However, the author tells us this was the chart from 1965. On the latest 2017 chart, even the lowest survival rate is over 85%, and that's in small countries with a tiny population. The vast majority, including China, India, and other developing countries, are on the same side as developed countries. What's on the other side? Nothing. This shows that even today, many people still talk about the world with 1965 knowledge, and the imagined chasm separating the world does not exist. One of the author's survey questions is, how many people live in low-income countries? Most people chose 59%, but the correct answer is 9%. Yes, only 9% live in low-income countries. And even in low-income countries, life isn't as bad as you think. The average life expectancy exceeds 60 years, most children are vaccinated, and most girls graduate from elementary school. How can we break this binary thinking? It starts by recognizing that the world is a continuum. The author suggests replacing the distinction between developed and developing countries with a continuum concept. For example, we can divide all countries into 4 levels based on per capita income. Level 1 is the lowest, corresponding to extreme poverty, and level 4 is the highest, roughly understood as having a car and a house. Roughly speaking, 1 billion people live at level 1, 5 billion at levels 2 and 3, and 1 billion at level 4. After 17 years of effort, the author finally convinced the World Bank to stop using the concepts of developed and developing countries and divide all countries according to this 4-level framework. In daily life, to control this cognitive instinct, we should focus on the majority within the whole rather than on extreme cases. Extreme cases suggest conflict, easily impressing people, and over time becoming fixed perceptions. Instead, we should focus on data showing the real lives of the majority, reflecting the actual situation. Next, the straight line instinct, the belief that trends will continue in a straight line. A common example is the belief that the world population is constantly growing. Although it is true that the population is growing, it will not continue to grow in a straight line. Straight line thinking makes us believe that if no action is taken, the population will grow in a straight line, depleting resources, and the earth will eventually be unable to support these people. This instinct also comes from ancient times. In nature, many things move in straight lines. When facing danger, our ancestors predicted trajectories to avoid collisions and injuries. Today, drivers still rely on straight line thinking, playing a crucial role. Given the population explosion over the past 2 centuries, straight-line thinking makes people believe that growth will continue. The media often say that some regions, influenced by religion and tradition, have high fertility rates. People's impressions of unfamiliar regions come from the media, creating a misconception that, given the ability to support more children, people in these regions will breed like crazy, burdening the earth. Some even question whether the Gates Foundation's efforts to help these regions escape poverty are misguided. This notion is absurd. The world now has 2 billion children. In about 100 years, by 2100, how many children will there be? 2 billion, 3 billion, or 4 billion? Even the experts at the Davos Forum couldn't answer. The correct answer is 2 billion. The author predicts that the number of children will remain stable over the next 100 years, indicating that religious or cultural factors won't lead to higher birth rates. In the past, many children were born because some didn't survive. As poverty is reduced and child survival rates increase, regions with higher birth rates will see declines, with each couple having only 2 children. So, population growth will not be in children but in adults. As life expectancy increases, the population aged 45 to 75 will grow in the future. This shows that population growth is complex and cannot be predicted by a simple straight line. To break the straight line instinct, we must recognize that the world is not just straight lines but also curves, including bell-shaped and random curves. For example, we know that babies grow quickly in the first 6 months, increasing in height by a third, but we don't expect this rapid growth to continue indefinitely. Growth slows down and may surge again during puberty, stabilizing afterward. Human height growth is a typical curve with both upward and stable periods, applicable to other complex matters. We've discussed 2 instincts, binary thinking and straight-line thinking, affecting our cognitive framework. Now let's examine instincts where emotions hijack reason. First, the fear instinct. When fear dominates our minds, rational thinking becomes nearly impossible. We mistake normal things for ominous signs and always imagine the worst. The author shares an example. In 1975, young Rosling was a Swedish doctor handling an emergency for the first time. A plane crash had left a pilot injured and bleeding. Rosling asked the pilot about his condition, but the pilot's speech was trembling. Rosling thought the pilot was speaking Russian, concluding he was a Soviet pilot shot down in Sweden, signaling a Soviet attack in the outbreak of World War III. Rosling stood there not knowing what to do. A senior nurse came over, skillfully handled the injuries, and told Rosling that the pilot was trembling due to cold from the ice used for pain relief. The pilot was Swedish, and this was a regular civil aviation accident. Years later, Rosling couldn't forget his fear or the absurd thoughts driven by it. Reflecting on this, Rosling identified several types of fear. Physical harm, such as violence from people or animals, sharp objects or nature's forces. Confinement, fearing imprisonment, losing freedom or control. And contamination, fearing invisible infection and poisoning. These fears come from our ancient ancestors. Data shows that today's people rarely face these feared situations. For example, in the 1930s, over 400 people per million died from natural disasters. By 2016, it dropped to 10. In 1942, Bangladesh suffered 2 years of weather disasters without international aid, resulting in 2 million deaths, largely unknown due to media absence. In contrast, Nepal's 2015 earthquake, though heavily reported, saw timely humanitarian aid mitigating casualties. Though today's people face fewer natural disasters, media sensationalism exacerbates fear. In reality, modern methods significantly reduce disaster impacts. To overcome the fear instinct, first recognize that news is not reality but selective and biased. Learn to distinguish that what frightens is not necessarily dangerous. Many fearful things are distant, not worth undue attention. For instance, many enjoy long periods of peace, far from war, and vaccines have reduced general disease risks. After the fear instinct, let's discuss the blame instinct, which shifts responsibility to others. When facing problems, people prefer to find a scapegoat rather than rationally analyze complex causes. The easiest targets are minorities, such as outsiders, foreigners, or immigrants. An example involves global environmental issues. Some people believe if populous developing countries like India and China reach developed status, Earth's resources and environment will be overwhelmed. At a Vancouver University lecture, a participant said, "They can't live like us. their emissions will ruin the planet. This statement went unchallenged, but Rosling analyzed it. Data shows half of global CO2 emissions come from level 4 countries, the most developed. Canada's per capita emissions are twice China's and 8 times India's. It would take decades for lower-level countries to develop enough to significantly increase emissions. Rosling concluded, "It's not that they can't live like us, it's that we can't keep living like this." To overcome the blame instinct, avoid imagining individuals as all-powerful. No matter what happens, don't just blame individuals, but reflect on oneself. Once a scapegoat is found, rational thinking stops, hindering problem-solving and preventing recurrence. In summary, we discussed several human cognitive instincts, those affecting our cognitive framework, particularly binary and straight-line thinking, and those allowing emotions to hijack reason, particularly fear and blame instincts. These instincts hinder rational thought and skew our world perception. To conclude this session, we first shared data showing the world is getting better, highlighting human progress, especially in recent decades. We then explored why most people believe the world is getting worse, identifying outdated knowledge, media misinformation, and inherent cognitive instincts disrupting our rational understanding. Lastly, we examined cognitive instincts like binary and straight-line thinking, and emotional instincts like fear and blame, suggesting we should embrace the world's complexity, update our knowledge, use data for decisions, and face facts. Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman in Thinking Fast and Slow describes two thinking systems: unconscious system 1, which relies on intuition, and conscious system 2, which requires deliberate analysis. System 1's quick judgments often lead to biases and errors, while System 2's rational analysis aids better decision-making. For a deeper dive into Thinking Fast and Slow, check out the Daily Book Dive's interpretation. That's the essence of this book. The original book link is attached at the end for further reading. You can also click the share button below the video to share this book with your friends. Congratulations, you've just finished another book.